our next session, which is actually a panelist session. So I'll begin by introducing our three panelists that are going to be here to answer your questions this afternoon for our session called Ask a Native Plant Specialist. So our first specialist you did meet earlier today, this morning, is Jack Dash. Again, I will reintroduce him in case you weren't on this morning when he gave a presentation earlier. So Jack Dash is a naturalist and a writer based in Tucson, Arizona. He works as a horticulturist with the Arizona-Sonora Desert Museum, where he oversees the cactus, agave, mountain, woodland, and grassland gardens. He's also the president of the Tucson Chapter of the Arizona Native Plant Society. Jack has worked since 2017 on a Flora of the Atascosa Highlands in southeastern Arizona and is co-creator of the multidisciplinary digital archive Atascosa Borderlands. Thank you, Jack, for joining us again for this afternoon session. You are wealth of knowledge, so we're so lucky to have you. All right, our next panelist is Gayle Gratop. Actually, Gayle, I'm going to have you correct me. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
It's Gratop, and it happens all the time, so don't feel bad.
All right. So Gayle Gratop, thank you. Gayle is a resident of Northern Arizona since 1996 and has been working with native plants in the region since 2006. Throughout her career, she's been a botanist, horticulturalist, an educator, and has worked on many habitat restoration projects, removing invasive plants and subsequently planting native species. Gayle holds a BS in environmental studies from NAU, an MS in agricultural education from the U of A, Certificate of Horticultural Production from Yavapai College, and a Certificate of Horticultural Therapy from the Horticultural Therapy Institute in Denver. She is currently employed with the U of A Coconino County Cooperative Extension in Flagstaff, where she teaches gardening, horticulture, and agricultural literacy classes. Gayle is also the owner of a small backyard nursery, Let It Grow Native Plants in Flagstaff, which specializes in the production of locally sourced and locally grown Northern Arizona native plants. Her true passion is growing native plants and getting people excited about how amazing our local native flora is. So you're a perfect addition to our panelist session today. All right, and then last but not least is Dan Carroll. There's Dan. Dan earned his Bachelor of Science degree in zoology from NAU. He has a minor in chemistry and some additional emphasis in mathematics and geography. Most of his working career post-degree has been on the Colorado Plateau with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. He's held multiple positions with NRCS before retirement. One important position was several years working as a natural resource specialist on the Colorado Plateau ecological site descriptions. This included working with soils identification, soil health issues, plant identification, and plant data collection. This was in conjunction with plant and wildlife ecology for constructing state and transition models to describe those ecological processes. Post-retirement, Dan has continued work with federal as well as state and private entities on plant identification and plant data collection. So again, a great wealth of information and knowledge for us today. Thank you, Dan, so much for joining us. So again, this session is going to be driven by audience questions. That is the whole reason we're here. You have this opportunity to ask three plant people your burning questions that you have. Their knowledge spans the state. I'm not going to say they have a answer for every single question that might come in, but we'll do our best. And so I would ask that you use the Q&A box to ask your questions. And I think we may already have some that come in, unless they're follow-up questions for Anita. But I'm going to take a look now at our Q&A box, see what we have. And again, we're going to keep going until around 2 o'clock Arizona time. So we've got a good 40 minutes of this session. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box and let's get started. All right. This may be a question for Anita, but I think it can apply to you all as well, so I'm going to ask it to you. It says, regarding apps or applications for plant identification, I'm not sure if this is accurate for Arizona, but in Oregon, and a group of botanists tested 5 different apps to see how they ID'd 20 known specimens. Seek, which is identified with iNaturalist, was by far the most likely to get the correct ID. That's really interesting to hear. Just curious if any of you happen to have any thoughts on apps used for plant ID, if you happen to have a favorite, or if you found one that just seems to be terrible and you don't recommend it all. Feel free to unmute to let us know you know that you've got something to say about this. All right, Gayle, go ahead.
Well, I don't mean to sound negative about them, but I have loosely experimented, and I can't remember which one I was using, but I did take a picture of a Penstemon strictus and I called it a salvia. So that was kind of the the beginning and the end of my experience with those apps. So for me personally, I'd rather just get on SignNet or somewhere that I completely trust.
Okay. All right. So you just haven't found them as helpful for you. Jack or Dan, any other views on them?
Yeah, I in the past have used PlantNet. I think the big thing to keep in mind with any of these apps is that they may get you to family, they may get you to genus, but you should really take any species with a big old grain of salt. So again, they can be helpful for sort of putting you in the ballpark, but I wouldn't count on them in any way to give you, to be the final word on species identification for native plants of our region. And I'd really encourage us all, I know we've all moved so digital in this COVID era, but really one of the best possible resources is going to be your local herbarium or agricultural extension or botanical garden. So, as somebody who works kind of in that sphere, I don't want to be put out of business by these apps. So please do just ask your local experts. It's a great way to build connections within the community. And just keep in mind, these apps will only get you so close.
Okay. And Dan, if you happen to have any last thoughts, okay.
Yeah, I concur with Gayle. SEINet is really one of my better tools that I use up here. I cover a pretty wide area, so they have different places that it covers, and I utilize that. A lot of the apps have not been real good at identifying some of the stranger plants I've run into recently.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I know at least one of our additional presentations this afternoon does speak about, I think, at least one of these apps. So we might hear a different perspective later on, but great to hear your experience with it. All right. And then what steps would you recommend for starting a small native plant nursery? Let's maybe start with Gayle, since I know you are experienced in this, and then Jack and Dan will give you an opportunity to answer as well.
Well, I was lucky enough because I had a really significant background in growing natives. I was the grower at the Arboretum at Flagstaff for many years, so probably 7 years. And then I also worked under our Northern Arizona native plant grower guru, Jan Busco, here at the native plant nursery up at Grand Canyon. And plus, having a formal education in horticulture, that really, I feel like, gave me the tools to go ahead and take the dive and start my own plant nursery. I think that knowing what you're doing is going to be really important, because there's a certain finesse to growing natives. They can be really challenging. You have to, know the seed treatments. You have to know your resources for seeking out what treatments work best for these seeds. There's a lot of trial and error. I found that I would grow these plants that I thought that they were really, really cool. But then I would go to sell them when I was at the Arboretum and nobody would know what they were. So we would just plant them out in the gardens, which was, no loss. But I think knowing what the people want and getting those plants into their hands is really important, a really important aspect too. Figure out how you're going to sell them. Are you going to allow people to come to your house? Are you going to sell them out at a farmer's market? Are you going to sell them to, you know, I sell a lot to schools. I'm just well connected in the community, so people know me, and they know if they need native plants for a project, then they'll come see me. But yeah, I would say if you don't have a background in hort, do yourself a favor and take a couple of classes at least to get yourself going. And I don't have any fancy equipment. I just have, you know, it's not a greenhouse. It's a glorified season extender. It has no climate controls. Just learn too, also to, you know, I'm at 7,000 feet. So I have to grow, I grow with the season. So in the spring, I start putting my seeds into cold strat, and then I pull them out and then get them out into my little greenhouse probably around May. But there are times when I have to pull everything out and stick it back into my garage because it's going to dip well below freezing. And I've got little, you know, seedlings going in my greenhouse. So it takes a lot of work. It's more of a labor of love. You know, I'm not getting rich or anything off of it, but, you know, I sit at my desk all day at extension, or I'm out teaching classes, and I've just really missed touching plants. And that's the reason why I did it. So.
Okay, thank you so much for all that great insight. Jack, I know you also have experience in the nursery industry, so maybe you want to take the second response to this.
Yeah, I mean, that was a fantastic answer, Gayle, and kind of piggybacking off of that, there's a few things worse than like finding some really cool plant, growing it out, being really excited about it, and then finding that there is no interest in it, and it just sitting there and kind of getting root bound. Now, part of that is it's incumbent on growers and educators to get people excited about new plants and sort of emphasize the roles that they can play in a landscape. But for anyone that's just getting started out, I would say really start small. You know, pick a small number of species that you are kind of familiar with, that you know grow well in your area, and kind of start there, and or identify a gap. So for instance, you know, one that I would just throw out in Tucson is that there's really like one very excellent grower for seed grown ocotillo. And that person is kind of getting to the point of thinking about retiring. Now, it's slower growing them than bare rooting them, but it's much more sustainable. It's a better way to go about it. So obviously following Anita's guidelines to ethically and legally collect whatever seed you're going to collect, you know, growing out a plant for which there is a current gap and a need is a really good way to get started. And then as you gain expertise and experience and maybe start acquiring more space to grow, you can really begin to step up from that point. But don't overextend yourself and try and start growing, you know, 150 things in these tiny amounts. It's really beneficial to start small and grow organically. Yeah.
Thank you. And Dan, do you happen to have any additional thoughts?
You know, I'm not much help on this one. In my work experience, I've been more involved with larger projects and farms and ranching concerns, large reseeding projects, things like that, but nothing in the greenhouse type of work other than local farmers doing some early stuff for vegetable for their marketing purposes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no problem. All right, and then for our next question, one of our panelists from earlier this morning has a question. We're going to let her ask that herself since she's unable to gain access to the chat like the rest of us if she's a panelist. So Julia, please go have your question.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Anita especially brought up the issue of the Arizona native plant law. And, you know, this is one of our bulwark laws concerning native plants. And in my own work at Pima County, we have to do a lot of these notifications for our construction projects to provide opportunities for salvage. So the salvage program is has been traditionally largely the province of people who are focused on the cacti and to a certain extent the ocotillo. I guess my question to the panelists would be, you know, if you were thinking about either revisions to the native plant law, or, strengthening the native plant law? What might be some of the improvements that you might suggest? Or, perhaps you could also relate your experience maybe with the salvage aspect of, going in, receiving those notices from the state about upcoming clearances on private land. Have you worked with the salvage program?
Jack.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say about, particularly thinking about like the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society, which is really active in salvage, I think in one sense, it's really a fantastic way to sort of take advantage of human nature. People, they sort of tend to have an angle, and the salvage program really offers people a reason to become interested in some of these native plants because they can take them home and have them in their landscape. So I think in that sense, it's really well thought out in that it kind of takes advantage of how people already think, where they want something for the time and effort they put in. And I think that's really a good way to get people involved, and then their interest and involvement can grow from that point. I do think that right now the focus is really on the cacti and the succulents. They're a bit more like charismatic, but I definitely think finding other sort of keystone species that could be salvaged and could be brought into people's landscapes would be a good way to broaden that program. And then the other thing I'd point out is we had a recent kind of discussion within the Native Plant Society. We received a request for sort of our opinion from the Coronado National Forest for people that they had requests to go out, and people wanted to harvest like saguaro skeletons and boots, presumably for sale. And we offered our opinion that that was not a sustainable use. So I think aside from the plants, it's important to note that, we don't necessarily want people taking anything out of the ecosystem. Because we have such a lack of organic matter here, any sort of decomposition that we have that adds organic matter or provides food sources for native wildlife, insects, microorganisms is really essential. So, aside from just thinking about the living plants that people are salvaging, we should really be encouraging people not to even be taking dead portions of plants out of the desert.
Gayle or Dan, any additional thoughts? Okay, well, thank you very much, Julia, for your question. I appreciate it. We do have several that have come in the Q&A box, so we'll just keep moving forward with those. So our next question says, I've been trying to find a resource that describes the characteristics of grass families, tribes, etc., similar to the books that describe plant families, but that would focus on smaller taxonomic levels within the grass families. Do you have any suggestions? Jack, you're shaking your head. Not sure if you're just in agreement with that question or have a suggestion.
Yeah, one book that I have found really helpful is Grasses of the Southwestern United States by Frank Gould. It's an older book, but it really gets into the sort of the tribes within the grasses and then breaks down common characteristics of the individual genera. So I would say Grasses of the Southwestern United States by Frank Gould is great. There is a Grasses of the Southwest, a key to common species using vegetative features by Steve Chad. That's CHADDE. That's another great resource because it's really focused on differentiating species and genera using the vegetative rather than floral characteristics of the grasses, which is important because much of the year, that's really all you have to go off of. So I would say if you started with Gould or with Chad's book, those would both be great resources.
Or Dan, any other suggestions?
Jack just stole my answer. Both those books are just very important in my use in getting to keying out stuff. But yeah, they're great. They're the best.
Great, and then I'll just put a plug since we're on the topic of grasses here. The winter issue of Arizona Native Plant Society's Plant Press Arizona which I assume will be coming out maybe this month or sometime next month. The focus is on grasses, so that will definitely be of interest to the person who asked this question. I'm sure as well as most of you here as well. All right, next question. What percentage of plants in Arizona are native? So maybe, maybe we're considering urban areas that have a lot of, non-native plants that have been introduced, or the prevalence of invasive plants in some areas. Any guesses, any three of you, of what percentage of the plants we have here in Arizona are actually what we would consider native? Doing the math in your head.
Not everybody at once now.
You're asking a bunch of plant people a math question.
Or maybe maybe not to get a specific number. Maybe do you think it's a problem? Like, does Arizona seem to be overrun by non-native plants? Or does it maybe just depend on the area?
I would say it probably just depends on where you are. I mean, there are plenty of places that are completely intact still, but then you're in maybe an urban environment. Like, I'm looking at a parking lot across the street from our extension office, and there's nothing but invasives in there. So I think it probably just depends.
Yeah, I don't have an exact answer for the whole state. I think it does vary significantly by area. Just speaking from personal experience, like in my Flora of the Atascosa Highlands, there's a fairly high percentage of non-natives. So, in a lot of the floras from southern Arizona, you might see between, 6 to 10% of given flora being non-native, recognizing, of course, that non-native doesn't always mean invasive. You might have one or two of something that, adds to the total number of taxa in a given area. But that doesn't really speak to the relative abundance. And that's the other factor is, in some areas, you might only have one or two invasives, but those invasives might be extremely dominant. So I know that doesn't exactly answer the question, but I would say it does depend regionally.
John, any other thoughts?
Out in the open country here, of course, like I say, everybody talks about it depends on where you're at, but in most of the open country, I'm going to lean towards, 90% native, and anything that's introduced or invasive, noxious, like I say, that's usually a fairly minor component, but you can still be standing on a spot that's just overwhelmed with either brush and thistle or whatever the case may be. Camel thorn is another noxious weed up here that we have that gets into some low, very fine textured soils near water courses, and you can be standing in the middle of it. But over the larger span of this country up here, it's better than 90% native. So.
Yeah, that was a tricky question. So good answers there. Anything could come at us today during this session. Next, I've always heard that purple fountain grass is an invasive exotic that spreads in the desert. Then someone told me that purple fountain grass has sterile seeds. Are the sterile seed varieties only a small subset of all purple fountain grasses? If so, what is the name of the sterile seed variety and where can you buy it? I have non-botany friends who are insistent on planting this rather than native grass varieties like Cooperative.
Yeah, I can say there's, a number of cultivars out there that are sterile. They have, like so many trade names, they're just completely goofy. I know of two that I can think of off the top of my head. One of them is praline, and the other is cayenne. I don't know who gets paid to come up with this stuff. But what I would say is, in general, you should try and, for yourself, really draw a hard line there. The difficulty being that your neighbor or friend might have the foresight to plant a sterile cultivar, but somebody just driving by might see it, think it's really pretty, and go out and buy a plant that isn't necessarily sterile. And I don't, know if this has been the case yet, but I know the Arizona Native Plant Society Conservation Committee, particularly John Schuring, has been working to expand the noxious weed list here in Arizona. So My hope would be that purple fountain grass finds its way onto that noxious weed list. But yeah, again, I would just try and draw a hard line and really encourage people to steer clear.
There's so many great native grasses out there too that are very easy to grow often. A lot of times they don't even need treatments. So I would just encourage everybody to appreciate the beauty of our native grasses and go with those. I worked a lot of my career in Grand Canyon, and we killed a ton of pampas grass, and we would have to go up to all the hotels up on Marble Canyon and beg them to remove their pampas grass because all those seeds were just blowing into the Grand Canyon, and then we were having to deal with them. So I would just say if you can find the plant material, and if you can find the plants, I would just steer clear of grasses like fountain grass.
Deanne, any additional thoughts?
No, not something I really deal with up here.
Okay, yeah, it's only, I think, a major problem in certain parts of the state. So, all right, our next question, let me mark that complete. So this is an interesting question, I think, because triangle leaf bursage, at least again in certain parts of the state, is very prevalent. But this question is, are there any tips on growing triangle leaf bursage? So perhaps it's not as easy to grow, horticulturally as it is just out there in the wild.
That's a common Arizona upland species where we're at in Tucson. It's one of the really common sort of backbone species at the Arizona-Sonora Desert Museum where I work. It's really hard to give specific how to grow information because it will differ just depending on where you're at. But just one basic tip for that plant and for many other natives, but this would definitely apply to triangle leaf bursage, is well draining soil. So, for most native plants, and certainly that one, just do not go out and buy your standard bag of potting soil. It's going to tend to be quite high in peat moss. Therefore, it will be pretty acidic, and also it's really trying to retain moisture. It's great for snapdragons, but pretty terrible for native plants. So you want to be erring on the side of having a planting mix that will drain quite well. It will mean that you're losing a lot lower percentage of seedlings when you get started. And again, start in a small container and size up as the plant's root mass and above ground biomass grow.
Any other tips? Okay. All right. Thank you. Next question. Do any natural resource agencies need help from us, meaning maybe the public, volunteers, in growing out natives for restoration work? So I'm going to address this to our panelists, and also Anita, who just presented, she also wants to chime in on this. So once we're done with our panelists, we'll go to Anita for her thoughts. Gayle, go ahead.
Up here in the northern part of the state, and actually we're doing some work too with borderland restorations, but I've been working alongside the Institute for Applied Ecology for maybe 5 years, just like super part-time work. And they have a really great program where so this is where I step in. I'm kind of the liaison between these farmers and then the farmers who are traditionally growing food crops, but there's such a need for native plant material for restoration projects that the Forest Service got on board with the Institute for Applied Ecology. And what we're doing is we're finding farmers who are interested in putting these seed increase fields on their properties. So that's one way that they the land agencies are working with the general public to get this seed, and then eventually the seed, it's wild collected from where the projects are going to happen. So I help with that. And then the seed gets grown out, it gets planted out, and then it gets harvested, and then it gets sent back to the Forest Service or whoever else needs that seed for restoration purposes. We work with growers on a pretty small scale, so like 1/10 of an acre sometimes, sometimes a little bit bigger, but we just kind of start small, so it's more manageable for the people, the farmers, so they're not getting completely discouraged, because you know, growing out a native milkweed is a lot different than, you know, growing you know, tomatoes or whatever you're used to growing. You have to know when to harvest the seed. Yeah, when it's ripe, you know, with Asclepias, you know, they open up and then the seed's gone. So so yeah, I mean, there's definitely programs that are out there where people are doing that kind of work, and it doesn't even really have to be farmers. Essentially, it can, you know, I'm probably going to be working with some private landowners this spring who are interested in helping with that as well.
Great to hear. Dan or Jack, any other insight into any natural resource agencies that are looking for volunteers to help grow natives for restoration?
My experience is with much larger scale seeding projects. So commercial seed sources have been what's been used by my agency and different outfits that I've worked with. 10,000 acres is a little tough to grow enough seed for somebody to have an effect on.
Yeah, I want to turn it over to Anita because I think she'll have a great answer, but just really briefly, I can really only speak to more of the nursery side and the, you know, nonprofit side. Definitely getting involved with groups like Borderlands Restoration. They are always looking for volunteers. IAC is often posting jobs for, you know, crew leads and seed collectors. And one way to just, if you are interested, I will plug that the Arizona-Sonora Desert Museum accepts botany department volunteers. It's a good way to familiarize yourself so that you can then go on and potentially grow some of this stuff yourself. But I'd love to hear what Anita has to say.
So real quick, I'm gonna talk from the farmer standpoint, and also from, this is kind of, you know, what I work with a lot with the public up here. Okay, so absolutely, natural resource agencies need help in growing out natives. There are, Gayle is a huge resource. She doesn't know, she's one of my heroes on this one. So, but BLM Seeds of Success is a program. Just to back up a little bit, most of the land management agencies have done national seed strategy outlines for restoration work. And because fires have gotten so big and so intense, there's not enough seed to be able to reforest them. And the seed strategies require native seeds to be established, native plants to be established in those areas. You cannot harvest enough native seed to be able to go after a 10,000 to 100,000 acre fire. And that includes all the little different ecotones in there. So there is intense need for it. With that being said, one of the best resources that you can go to is the Institute for Applied Ecology Southwestern Seed Partnership. And you can just go do a quick Google search, Southwestern Seed Partnership. They are working with all the agencies, and they are also helping tie in the farmers to the agencies to be able to do this. I am one of the farmers for them, and a couple other, will be one of the farmers for them, and then I do grow out for a couple other places. There's also a native plant, I'm just gonna make sure I get this right, a native seed conference put on by the Native Seed Network, and it is next year in Washington, D.C., March 27th through the 30th, and the theme is cultivating the restoration supply chain. So if you're interested in that point, they're asking for abstracts, but it is a great thing to visit and to go to. So if you can, definitely go to that. It is in person. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that also is happening virtually. I'm pretty sure that that is listed on the events on the Native Plant Society's webpage. I'm pretty sure, I think I added it. So I think that's the same conference that you're mentioning. So it is listed there if you'd like to learn more about what that conference is. It's currently showing on the events list on the Native Plant Society website. Thank you, Anita. And then I'll just chime in with one last perspective. This is more from like just the, you know, the home gardener perspective. The Friends of the Tonto National Forest, I know they have had some initiatives where they were seeking volunteers to help with growing milkweed. and also saguaros. I'm not sure where they're currently at with that, if they are still in need of volunteers or not, but that is another organization you can look into if you're kind of in the maybe East Valley or Tonto Basin area. That might be something you'd be interested in. So some great options there from throughout the state for those of you who might be looking to help with growing for restoration, whether large or small. Next, there was a comment that came in that I'll state, and then maybe just see if any of you have any insight or additional thoughts on the comment. So the comment is, use deep containers when growing most native plants. So any additional thoughts on that comment?
If I may, I think that it's hard to make generalizations about growing native plants. Again, one of the big enemies you sort of run into when growing native plants is seedling loss due to damping off and rot. And so I think that comment would probably hold true for, let's say, oaks, mesquites, things with intensive, that is deep root systems, but do keep in mind that many of our native species, particularly succulent and cacti, have extensive, shallow, wide root systems, and so they won't actually be able to fully utilize all of the soil in a deep container for, if you're growing them. So that comment would apply to some species, but just you can't generalize too much.
Yeah, I agree. And I've grown in the deep pots, and I've grown in, just normal 4-inch and 2-inch pots. And just from as a hort perspective, I think they're a nightmare to water, the deep pots. And then also, who wants to dig that big hole when you're out there gardening? So I kind of I've definitely moved away from the deep pots.
Lastly, Dan, any comments on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, people have already talked about it during this session, is that the lack of organic material, that's something you have to kind of build your soil a little bit here. And then, once again, depending on what it is, if you're working with most of our native species, the soil here is adequate for, growing whatever you need. You need to have the big problem here is just having enough water to get things started, and hope that the climate will help boost things along, because most of this stuff is really drought tolerant to a certain degree, but establishment is the big deal.
Okay, great. So unfortunately, it's not as simple as you could, just use a tall pot for native plants and you'll be good to go. It really is species specific when it comes to trying to grow things. So good to know. And I'll just make a comment that in the Q&A box, one of our audience members also mentioned a resource regarding the Pima County Native Plant Nurseries always welcoming volunteers. So another opportunity to help grow. Actually, 2 people mentioned that now. Another opportunity to help grow plants for restoration purposes. All right. Next question says the Arizona Department of Transportation's commitment to using native plants started in the 1990s and helped sell plants. Keeping that connection warm is good. What other larger market can currently be courted for selling native plants?
Yeah, if I may, I think, there's a lot of development, for better or for worse, happening in Arizona at this point. Certain cities are starting to regulate, use of native plants in landscapes, but I would say probably one of the largest markets is just the developers. If you can get someone who's developing, not just one, but maybe several subdivisions throughout Arizona at any given moment, and get them to commit to using native plants, I think that's a really large and active market for making sure that we're selling native plants. And also, one question we consistently get at the Native Plant Society is somebody who lives in a neighborhood and their HOA essentially bans the use of native plants, not for any particular reason other than just sort of ignorance out of their value. and how beautiful they can be. So I think if we can get these neighborhoods when they're constructed to be utilizing Arizona native plant species, you're going to change a lot of people's minds right off the bat and not have to kind of come in retroactively, try and change some extremely arbitrary HOA rules made up by somebody who moved here a year ago from the East Coast.
Right, Gail or Dan, any additional thoughts on ADOT and other markets? No? Okay. And since you brought up the topic of HOAs, Jack, our technical guru today, Ray Harwood, he actually is highly involved with an HOA in the Phoenix area and has a question related to HOA. So we'll let him ask that question.
I've tried to get my landscape people to think about, put in native plants. I've had a guy here who is a decent, I don't know, a plant guy, he calls himself, and he made a design for one of our entrances that used a couple of native plants when I was hoping it would be more. I think from an HOA perspective, you're probably right, Jack, but the problem is we don't just need someone to sell us. If we're going to be doing a refurb, even a new guy putting in a new development, we need someone to help do the design as well. And so I guess my question is there anyone who not only sells native plants, but also will come in and do a design? Because what we want and what the developers want is not something that's going to look scraggly most of the time. They want things that will flower. And we've got a couple of native plants in one of our entrances now that have beautiful flowers when they're flowering. And if I could just get enough of them paced out so that something would be flowering all the time, we'd be in good shape. That's kind of my thing.
Yeah, just in response to, oh, sorry, please go ahead, Gail.
No, well, I just have a comment about that. And then Jack, I mean, you know a lot more about the southern part of the state than I do, but it seems like the thing with the landscape companies is they're at the mercy of the wholesalers. That's where they're getting their plants. And there might be a few natives that some of the wholesalers are selling, but in general, it's mostly cultivars. So it's what they can get their hands on. So I think that is a huge part of the problem. Up here in Flagstaff, we were lucky enough to have Flagstaff native plant seed, who's not around anymore, but they were growing their own natives. And then they also, you know, they went out and they did the designs, and they did the landscape designs and the maintenance and stuff. But there's very few landscape companies that are like that. So I think that you would have to find somewhere down there that has that kind of fills that niche. And I don't know if there's even such a thing.
Yeah, what I found is one person way up the food chain in a landscape company that kind of understands what I'm talking about, and everyone else just basically wants to take out a backhoe and you know, put trees in.
Yeah. Well, and I'll say, you know, this is actually something that I think will continue to be an issue, because as we all know, demand for native plant materials are increasing. And I think this actually maybe speaks to the next question I see in the chat about identifying gaps. There is a lack of wholesalers. And, you know, I know that Mountain States Wholesale Nursery, which grows natives and cultivars, has been a big supplier for a lot of years. And I know they're closing, at least temporarily, it's not entirely clear, their growing yard in Glendale, and that's going to leave a big gap. So I think if we're talking about, you know, needs and gaps in terms of native horticulture, it is nurseries with an ability to scale up to be providing plants on a wholesale basis. And unfortunately, that is going to continue to be really difficult, if for no other reason than the price of property is becoming really expensive, and the startup costs to have a large scale wholesale nursery that isn't just absolutely throwing away water. You know, so greenhouses that have water reclamation systems, for instance, that's just becoming more and more prohibitive. So, you know, given that that's the case and that it's going to be difficult for new wholesalers to start, we may find that there has to be some sort of, you know, co-oping of smaller growers who are kind of specializing in different plants and are cooperatively promoting these and making them available at hopefully wholesale prices to landscapers. I do have hope that there are a lot of smaller landscapers in Tucson that are, designer landscapers that are really making a commitment to native plants, but it ultimately does cut into your profit margin, particularly at scale.
Cool, thanks.
Okay. And before, so we'll move on to that question that you alluded to, Jack, and then just one last comment on Ray's question. We get this question sometimes, to our chapter as well, about, sometimes, who's a particular landscaper you recommend, or who's maybe a landscape designer you recommend. And we don't have any particular recommendations per se, but I do often refer people to the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension's SmartScape website, which they have as like a certification or training program. It's not necessarily only focused like on native plants, but in general, more sustainable, earth-friendly practices for landscaping. And so they do have a list of practitioners who have gone through their training. And so that could be a good resource to try to help find. And then I'll just also mention a few audience members have entered into the Q&A session some additional comments and thoughts there. Brad Lancaster, who is big on rainwater harvesting and native plants, he might be a good resource for that as well. So take a look at the Q&A, Ray and others, if you want to maybe see some more insight into answering that question. But just to not miss out on the finishing that question that Jack started, it is along the topic of identifying needs and gaps. Can the panelists speak to current and upcoming gaps related to conservation, research, horticulture, etc. of Arizona's native plants? How are members of the Native Plant Society identifying these needs and communicating them? How can enthusiasts and amateur botanists best support these needs? So Jack, I know you already spoke a little bit, so I'll just first see if Gayle or Dan has any questions, but then I'll go back to you, Jack, just since you definitely have a Native Plant Society perspective on this question. Gayle or Dan, any thought? Nope.
Wait,
No.
Jack.
Okay. So back to Jack.
If I may, I know we're really focusing in this talk on growing native plants, and I think Anita kind of really did such a good job of addressing, some of the difficulties in the learning curve in terms of being able to legally and ethically get started in that field. What I can say from the Native Plant Society is that we recently sort of unveiled to the public our most successful restoration project in the Waterman Mountains. It was a collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management, and it was a long-term project. So one thing I would say is that, aside from this need to grow native plants, one of the biggest things that we need is dedicated people who are able to make a long-term commitment to mitigating invasive species. So, the big success in that area, and I think John Schuring is talking today, so I won't go too deep into it, is removing the invasives and planting some native species, but really with a bigger focus on removing the invasives, allowed the native seed bank that was already present to come into that space. And it's really been quite a successful restoration, but it's required people working for well over a decade, going out there extremely regularly and keeping on top of it. So I could say one big need is just boots on the ground for people who are willing to do the hard work to remove invasive species over the long term, because it's not something you can do once and walk away.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We are at the end of our session. So I greatly appreciate you all taking the time for this probably a little bit daunting panel where you had no idea what type of questions would come in, but they were excellent questions and we really enjoyed your insight to them. So thank you very much.